Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Enjoy your flight.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to make a film, even a slightly middling James Bond one. So let's start there. Let's go back to the 1970s with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. It involves 007. It involves a space rocket. I'll play you a clip. Come to the story the other side of this.
From the most exotic locations on Earth, Moonraker will transport you to another world.
Trifle overpowering, your sense.
Holly was a warm girl with the right connections.
Could this possibly be the moment for us to pool our resources?
We would be better off working together.
More excitement, more thrills, more spills. And guess who's dropped in for a bite? Jaws is back.
So it's been a while since I've been in the world of James Bond, but we're back with 1979's Moonraker, directed by Lewis Gilbert. Screenplay for this one by Christopher Wood, based on the book Moonraker by Ian Fleming, and starring Roger Moore as James Bond 007, Lois Charles, Michael Lonsdale, Richard Keel, Corinne Clary and Jeffrey Keane, leading the main ensemble for the film. Now, I should say up front that one of my key references, certainly about talking about James Bond films, but for the purposes of this podcast as well, has been Matthew Field and A.J. Chowdhury's excellent book, Some Kind of Hero, the remarkable story of the James Bond films. But also, going back to the 1970s, Star Wars has a lot to answer for, because when the first Star Wars movie, now known as A New Hope, landed in 1977, it fairly obviously changed blockbuster cinema forever. Queues round the block, a massive wave of excitement, the launch of a brand new science fiction franchise, and bringing in the kind of money that nobody saw coming too. And so, in true Hollywood style, if one thing makes a lot of money, everyone's heads turn towards it and a bit of a land rush begins. Lots of science fiction projects suddenly that had been percolating either in development hell or hadn't even existed when Star Wars came about, well, suddenly they were pushed forward. Look at 1980's Flash Gordon, for instance, a film I've covered previously on Film Stories. And in the midst of all of this, there was the James Bond saga, which was in a good place as we start this story in 1977. It was in pretty good nick. So 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me had firmly cemented Roger Moore in the role of 007, not least thanks to its terrific non-stop final act. The films were financially successful, and finally it was felt they'd survived the transition away from Sean Connery, which had been tricky to say the least in the first instance, and plans were swiftly being drawn up to make For Your Eyes Only Roger Moore's fourth outing in the tuxedo. So much so that if you go through the end credits of The Spy Who Loved Me, it says there at the end, James Bond will return in For Your Eyes Only, which he did, but not quite as quickly as originally anticipated. because Star Wars erupted, but even then, as late as February 1978, For Your Eyes Only was still the plan. That was going to be the next Bond adventure. Early work had got underway, locations were being scouted, and in fact, things had been starting to ramp up from the middle of 1977, ahead of the release of The Spy Who Loved Me. But in the library of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels was the 1955 text Moonraker, and this had a fairly obvious science fiction edge to it that would, in the view of producer Albert R. Broccoli, reflect more where cinema trends were heading. And so, I mean, Moonraker was a film that it was a story that Ian Fleming had previously tried to get to the screen. The rights had been sold for screen adaptation in the 1950s, didn't get anywhere, and so Fleming bought back the rights to his book in 1959, and it wasn't even a book that Broccoli, the overlord of the Bond saga at this point, was massively keen on. I mean, it wasn't really one that people were massively campaigning to get made, but still, Broccoli decided to pivot, because he'd come through a tumultuous time over the previous years where the Bond saga was concerned, not least the ownership and the creative direction and the very heavily reported split between Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, who'd been there right from the start of getting these Bond movies made. And so Broccoli really was going a bit more alone here, but also the parent company behind the James Bond films, United Artists, that was backing them and distributing them, well, that was having a bit of a time as well. That the core management team at United Artists had suddenly left, and a new studio president was in place, Andreas Albeck. And Albeck had to quickly assure Hollywood that United Artists was still the place to bring your projects. This was a good home for filmmakers, and thus he needed to get things moving. With that in mind, James Bond was going to be key to the continuity of United Artists, and so moving the next Bond film into production, that was core. And so again, all of these trends came together, and with a kind of an eye on that Star Wars success, a pivot to Moonraker took place as the next Bond adventure, and that was timed in early 1978, really, when that plan formulated, at a point where the film was due to be in cinemas in 1979, and this was going to be quite the endeavour as well, because the Bond team hadn't done special effects, certainly not science fiction effects on the scale that the project was going to require, but still they were moving ahead. United Artists was happy with this. United Artists also decided it was going to show Hollywood by making a film with a director called Michael Cimino, The Deer Hunter, as it would turn out. That individually is a film that would probably cover 3 episodes alone, and then we get to Heaven's Gate, which is the rest of the United Artists story, and that is like a podcast series. That notwithstanding, Roger Moore at this stage had completed his initial contract to play 007. When he was brought in for Live and Let Die, it was on a 3-picture deal, and so it was now going forward required that Moore was going to negotiate on a film-by-film basis to continue in the role of 007, but there was never really much doubt that he was going to do so, and in the end he was fairly happy to sign on the dotted line, and so James Bond would return. More to the point, Roger Moore would return, and so in came screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz. Now, Mankiewicz's job in this was to pen the first outline for what the film was now going to be, and this was delivered at towards the end of March 1978, and it wasn't an outline at that stage that was particularly well received, nor, as the story goes, was that much of it actually used. I mean, already it was very clear that the film of Moonraker was going to go very, very far away from Ian Fleming's source text, but Mankiewicz had fashioned a story that took in locations in Guatemala and Mexico, and as the book Some Kind of Hero details, against this backdrop, Albert R. Broccoli got an invite from the Brazilian government to go to Rio de Janeiro, and he had his head turned while he was there. He came back from Brazil and was just like, we've got to shoot here. This is going to be a location for a Bond film. Well, that wasn't in Mankiewicz's original outline for Moonraker as it stood. In fact, it wasn't even called Moonraker at that point. That title would be adopted, and formally the project would be going forward as that a couple of months later when Mankiewicz submitted treatment number 2. Now, this was edging much more towards the Moonraker that we ultimately got. And it was off the back of this treatment that Broccoli gave it a tick and handed the job of writing the full screenplay to the film to Christopher Wood. Now, a logical choice, because Christopher Wood, he had just worked on The Spy Who Loved Me. The Spy Who Loved Me had been a raging success, and so continuity of talent, well, that was a good idea. Now, Wood knew, and he was keenly aware really, that this was going to be a transitional Bond film, whether that was the brief he was given at the start or the realisation that came through the making of it. Because James Bond was ultimately going to go into space. The character was evolving to reflect the heightened nature of what was happening on screen as well. And so Wood put all this into his screenplay, submitted that in the middle of May 1978. And so Albert R. Broccoli brought in a bit more help just to get it all polished and into place. So Vernon Harris, he came in to do a bit of work on it. And then a familiar screenwriting duo, Dick Clement and Ian La Frenais, people who Sean Connery had regularly used to beef up some of his writing. I mean, go back to The Rock. Sean Connery calls Clement and La Frenais to put in just a bit more punch and humour to the character. And obviously, they've got this hugely successful background in British television comedy shows such as Porridge as well. Wrote films like The Bank Job, starring Jason Statham. We've covered that before as well. And as Dick Clement noted, he said, I'm quoting Some Kind of Hero book, where it just this beautiful sentence. Clement was struck by a chilling note in the script. It just said, "Note, from this moment on, everyone is weightless." And it's described as one of those little things that puts millions on the budget in one sentence. And already Moonraker was shaping up to be a far more expensive beast than The Spy Who Loved Me. On 10th of May 1978 came the announcement Moonraker was officially going to be the 11th James Bond movie. But also, it was going to be one of the last films to take advantage of what was known as the Anglo-French Film Treaty. Now, this was an agreement that ran from 1965 to 1979 and was pushing co-productions made in Europe. Also around this time, the tax rates in the UK were spiralling too high for Albert R. Broccoli's liking, and so he decided to leave the UK. He upped sticks to go and live in America, unhappy at the amount of income tax he felt he was paying. He wasn't the only one to do it around there. And the high personal tax rates and also the high rates that they felt they would have to pay to film Bond in the UK, well, these were having an impact on the plans for the project. And so the Anglo-French Film Treaty gave them financial incentives and breaks and helped really leverage more for every pound that was being spent on the film. This meant, though, that rarely for a James Bond film, the Bond stages that had been built at Pinewood Studios just outside of London, well, they were going to lie primarily dormant for lots of this one, because Moonraker's base of operations wasn't going to be its traditional home of Pinewood. Instead, it was going to go to Paris. And what would happen, Pinewood would end up being used, but it would be housing special effects work, of which I'm going to come to shortly. And so what this meant was that Moonraker had become officially a French-English co-production. And Broccoli would say that his company, Eon Productions, would own 45% of it. And then it was a French firm, Les Productions Artistes Associés, it says here, would take the other 55%. But then it was also going to be expensive, and having someone else to foot some of the bill, well, that sounded like quite a good idea, because the budget for the negative heading into pre-production was pegged at $25 million. Now, by 1970s money, that's enormous. Now, by the state of my own personal bank account, that would be enormous as well. But in particularly when making a film at that stage, that was the kind of money that was just very, very rarely spent. And, I mean, just pushing just a little bit ahead in the story, that figure would not be stuck to. Just to give some kind of comparison of where this was coming from, The Spy Who Loved Me had been made for a comparably modest $13.5 million. And that was hardly viewed as on the cheap side. But Moonraker, well, the ambitions for the project were going through the roof. Now, that co-production status had an interesting knock-on when it came to the casting of the film, because, the villain, Drax, is one of the very few things actually taken from Fleming's source novel here. I think Drax is one of the best villains in the whole James Bond cinematic saga. You can fight me on this if you want. And Hugo Drax was originally going to be played by an English actor, a British actor, James Mason. But even though they'd pressed ahead with him at one stage and were looking to do that, If they'd have gone with Mason, what it would have done is disqualified the movie from the breaks it was getting under the Anglo-French Treaty, because for this to be a co-production, it required prominent French actors in key roles as well. And so Roger Moore was clearly not going to be recast. He was ticking the Anglo box. Having James Mason in there, they'd have lost the French side of the agreement, and they'd have lost the breaks that they needed to get the film made. And so there were other names then came into the fray. Stuart Granger, Louis Jourdan were both considered, but it was Michael Lonsdale who would ultimately get to take on the role of Drax. Lonsdale, French actor, had impressed particularly in Fred Zimmerman's excellent Day of the Jackal. I far prefer that to the Hollywood remake that followed in the 1990s. And so he was invited to take the role on and duly signed on the dotted line. And also Corinne Clary joined the ensemble too. There were one or two near misses of people who didn't quite get in. I mean, Jacqueline Smith, for instance, was enjoying success with the Charlie's Angels TV show, and she had to turn down a chance to appear in Moonraker because of her commitments to Charlie's Angels. And then, surprisingly, Richard Kiel returned, because that wasn't originally the plan when he was cast in The Spy Who Loved Me. However, the popularity of Richard Kiel playing the role of Jaws in that film had led to thousands of letters arriving at the offices of Eon Productions, that Broccoli, for one, talked to the Bond offices, receiving lots and lots and lots of missives, particularly from young fans, asking them to bring Jaws back. However, if they were going to bring back Jaws, would they bring him back in exactly the same guise? Well, Kiel was clearly going to play him, but the conversation took place, and Kiel was key to this, about softening the character, making him less of a villain, and instead, how about this, why not bring in a romantic interest for him as well? So that was the plan they were going with. And for a while, the idea was to make Richard Kiel's romantic interest in the film as sizable a physical presence as him. Kiel, though, felt it should go the other way, that this was going to be more comedic, and he was drawn to the physical idea of him being a particularly sizable man and his partner in the film being less of size. How's that? Not a million miles reflected for how things were for him at home as well. And that's ultimately how Blanche Ravaillac got a break in the role of Dolly in the film, because they went for someone who was significantly smaller than Kiel, and it meant that instantly there was just a little bit of physical comedy just due to the distinction of their appearance. Now, you might think that just a throwaway joke in a Bond film. Let us not forget that a decade later, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito basically got a whole film just out of that gag. So, going back to the rest of the team that Broccoli was looking to pull together to make Moonraker, well, he was happy to keep a winning team together here. And thus, Lewis Gilbert had been lured back to 007 to direct The Spy Who Loved Me. He'd sat out the film before, and he would agree to take on Moonraker as well. This time, too, it would be his third James Bond film. He would get a small percentage of the film's back end as part of his deal. He wouldn't get that again, and it was quite a coup, really, for him to land that. It's worth noting, in the midst of this was the era when Steven Spielberg was actively angling to make a James Bond film as well. And he gave an interview to The Independent here in the UK in 2016, talking about after he'd had his success with Close Encounters of the Third Kind towards the end of the 1970s. He talked to Albert R. Broccoli, but this time they couldn't afford him. And that was one of his two scrapes with the Bond saga, a saga he was keen to make a film in, but clearly is never going to be. The pre-production on the film was underway, was proving intense. In fact, the script was proving quite challenging to put together as well. But there was cooperation. So NASA, for instance, allowed the filmmakers to go around their facilities and talk to some of their staff, just as part of the pre-production research for building the film. Then there was a very late change just in personnel as well, because director of photography Claude Renoir had been working for months getting ready to prep for the shoot of Moonraker. They got the location sorted, they knew where they were going. But just weeks before filming was due to begin, Renoir's eyesight suddenly started deteriorating. Now, Broccoli was very loyal to him and paid for him to have surgery in America, but Renoir's condition didn't reverse, and as it turned out, he would never be able to work again as a cinematographer, but it was he who recommended Jean Tournier in his place to take up the DP role, which he duly did, and production on Moonraker could begin on the 14th of August 1978. So that production began in Paris, and it was a monumental effort for Paris to be able to house it at this stage, because there was a trio of separate, usually competing film studios that were required to come together to handle the scale of what the filmmakers were trying to do. That Ken Adam was designing the film, and he had put together huge sets. And if you go into the DVD extras of Moonraker, it talks about how they took more than 200,000 human hours just to get these sets erected. And it required a bringing together of 3 different studio facilities to be able just to stage them all. And this, too, was bringing the budget up. And already that $25 million was looking on the ambitious side, let's just say that. But Ken Adam was not doing this on the cheap, and he was putting together some monumental work for the film. It wasn't entirely set in Paris, this one. Bond films trot around the globe. Sometimes they trot outside the globe, in the case of Moonraker. Location work, for instance, took place for the best part of a month in Venice at one stage, and then there was 3 weeks in Brazil towards the end of the shoot. And that's where we could bring in a James Bond tradition, that Bond actors tend to hit some kind of injury or health problem during the filming of the movies, and that was the case here, because Moore had kidney stones while shooting the film, and he was in particular discomfort during the sequences shot in Rio de Janeiro. Now, at one stage, it looked like he was going to require surgery for these kidney stones as well, and the recovery time from that was estimated at one point as, 2 to 3 months, which, I mean, you can imagine what that would have added to the budget. Comfortably would have added another $10 million just to cover restaging everything that needed to be done, and the delays, and rehiring the crew, and paying off all the bills and the commitments that they had. While Moore recovered, and he did recover quickly, and they were able to get the footage in Rio, and while the film was in Paris and in Venice, stop and think of the effects expert and miniatures genius Derek Meddings. Now, he was the person who was tasked with realising physically a lot of the effects that you see on screen, such as, say, the rocket launch sequence, which he had to put together with no direct reference footage to work from. He also had the job of bringing the space station sequences to film. Now, there was also some more traditional stunt work as well. I'll come back to some of those visual effects shortly, but there was some traditional stunt work, not least a skydiving sequence that was shot in California, overseen by future Bond director John Glenn, who was on second unit for this. That skydiving sequence involves some ingenuity just to make the camera equipment a bit more lightweight, just to be able to pull that off. And all the time, the cost was going up and up and up. And in parallel to this, Michael Cimino on the set of The Deer Hunter, well, he was not on the frugal side either. And so United Artists' 2 big projects, the ones that were going to, a statement of intent that it was very much at the heart of Hollywood, both were bleeding its finances dry. And in fact, these would have a knock-on for the next James Bond adventure, which I'll briefly touch on. It was going to basically have to be cheaper. And that's one of the key reasons for a start why Lewis Gilbert would not go on to direct the next James Bond adventure. There's a moment, again, that pops up in the Some Kind of Hero book that United Artists discovered in the budget for Moonraker a line that said special location facilities, and the amount next to it was $2 million. I mean, a fair amount of cash that. And United Artists executives probed this. What on earth was it? And they got some fairly woolly answers before they were given the direct lay of the land on this. That was money put aside for bribes to get the permissions they needed to access all the places they want to go and at the speed they wanted to take them. Now, Roger Moore would reflect on the experience of just the physical shoot of Moonraker, saying, "I spent 8 months working on it and it was back-breaking." He said, "I only had 3 days off in that whole time," and he had kidney stones, remember. And he said, "If you worked a horse like that, you'd be in trouble." And also, Broccoli was keen to beef up the publicity for this. He was never quite shy about that. Not least, here's Bond doing science fiction, and Moore talked about how 360 journalists came to the set. And he said, "It got to the point where I had to excuse myself to go and do a scene." And he said, "Spending 8 months being blown up and climbing under waterfalls and struggling through jungles isn't fun. And the real problem with Bond films is they're so physically taxing." It was a long shoot as well, and it was wrapped up on the 27th of February 1979. But all the while the shoot was going on, and also in post-production, there was that special effects work. Now, Broccoli was out living in Los Angeles at this point in his life, and he'd met in the early development of Moonraker with George Lucas's nascent ILM, Industrial Light and Magic Company, who'd, of course, smashed all the effects work on Star Wars, and got a quote from ILM on doing the effects work required for Moonraker. Let us just say that ILM was not particularly on the cheap side. The company wanted a lot of money up front, but also wanted a slice of the back end as well, and you can imagine what someone like Albert R. Broccoli would have made of that. Let's just say he politely declined that offer, and that's why Ken Adam and Derek Meddings got the nod to bring the visuals to life. And so Meddings would take over the 007 stage at Pinewood purely for his effects work. I mean, he was based there for the best part of a year, painstakingly getting this stuff on camera. The last effect for the film was completed in the middle of May 1979, and that was running really close to the wire as well. That United Artists had earmarked the 26th of June 1979 to premiere the film. And this has been the era, as I say often, way before digital distribution. You had to get your film finished weeks in advance just so you could get the requisite number of prints struck and then physically carted around the country. And so it ran it close, as modern Bond films tend to do, to be fair. But this was a bit of a race to the finish line. Music-wise, I mean, Frank Sinatra was in the running at one point to do the title track, not for the first time either, but it was Shirley Bassey who got the nod very late in the day. Not one of the best-known Bond title tracks either, and Bassey wasn't massively enthused with it. John Barry came in. He recorded the score in Paris rather than London for the first time as well. And the film was somehow finished with these hugely ambitious effects in the midst of it all. And so the premiere took place in the UK on the 26th of June 1979 with a wide release around the country just 3 days later. Before critics, thus the film went. And they were relatively impressed on the whole. That there was kind of a feeling that this was a bit of plot-wise, it was retooling quite a lot of stuff, that it was going a bit through the motions. However, the visuals, they were liked. Roger Moore, he was liked. Michael Lonsdale as Drax, I still think he's just terrific, really, really terrific. And it's only over time, really, that Moonraker's reputation has dwindled. It is not, I'm not spoiling things to say it is one of the least regarded James Bond films, and in historical context, it's a very obvious swing to try and get some of the Star Wars money. But it would be wrong to say that it failed in its ambition. As much as even those involved in the Bond saga in the aftermath of Moonraker have suggested they just went way too far with it, they went too silly, people turned up, and the film, which costed in the end in the region of $34 million, a staggering sum for that period of time, well, it opened and it was a huge success. So, I mean, let's just focus on the American release, for instance, in the first instance. It knocked a little film called Alien off the top of the US box office when it opened with $7 million that weekend of June 29th, July the 1st, 1979. Meatballs was around at that point as well. But $7 million, a really good return at that point. In the UK, it was doing even better as well. That the initial release of the film was breaking box office records. And by the time Moonraker had finished its theatrical run around the world, it had become United Artists' highest grossing film of all time. It had eclipsed the box office of The Spy Who Loved Me. It had been really expensive to make, so that had to be taken into account. But still, the global take for the film was $210.3 million, and that's the kind of number that Eon Productions, that United Artists, well, let's just say it put them firmly in a happy place. It was some 25 million more than The Spy Who Loved Me had made, and the feeling coming out of Moonraker was that the gamble had worked. Now, there were increasing critics. I mean, Sean Connery, amongst one of them, was not a fan of the film. And also, this would be the last time that a James Bond movie was directly adapted, well, directly in inverted commas, from an Ian Fleming novel until Casino Royale and the Daniel Craig era getting underway. It was also a sunset film for some Bond veterans as well, that Ken Adam would depart the series, Lewis Gilbert wouldn't return to it either, Bernard Lee would play M for the final time in Moonraker as well, and there was just a very, very slight changing of the guard. Not that it stopped the momentum of the series at all, because go through the credits of Moonraker and it does say again, for the second film running, James Bond will return in For Your Eyes Only. This time he did, but that is a story for another episode. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If you like this podcast, I'm in parish notice mode now. If you like this podcast and wouldn't mind supporting it, there are 3 ways you can do so. I'm really grateful for any stroke all of these you're happy to do. If you want to put a couple of pounds in the pot, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, well, you get this podcast ad-free for a start. That's nice. You also find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. You tend to get the podcast early as well. So I recently put out episode 300 with Hugh Jackman. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you got that ahead of everyone else. Costing you absolutely nothing is if you can just subscribe at your podcast home of choice, and also costing you nothing, leave ideally a hugely positive review. Stuff like that is gold dust to independent podcasts, and I thank everyone who's taken the time to do so. Also, we have print magazines. We have Film Stories. Issue 41 is nearly done, actually, at the point this is being recorded and just about to go to the print. And I've just released Film Stories, well, Film Junior issue 12, which is a print film magazine for under 15s. Imagine that growing up. Well, it exists, but it needs support to keep going. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. And if you're listening to this in time, I've got 2 live shows coming up. I'm in London at King's Place on Thursday, the 23rd of February 2023, and I'm at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham on Wednesday, March the 29th, 2023. These are for my Movie Geek live shows. It's going to be a lot of conversations about film, a couple of filmmaking guests, and hopefully a good night had by all. Hope so, anyway. But that's the end of the parish notices. I'm now going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode. I'm going to the late 1980s, to a breakout hit comedy that really nobody particularly saw coming. Let me set it up with a clip from the trailer from the film. I'll come to the story of this one the other side of this.
It's the most natural thing in the world.
No.
Yes.
No. What? How could this have happened?
I take it this wasn't a planned pregnancy.
It's a beautiful, magical experience.
St. Jerome's Hospital. Ah!
John Travolta.
Come on, breathe deep, breathe deep.
Try to help me, just try.
Kirstie Alley.
Give me some drugs. Oh, thank you a really lot.
Now that is a little more like it. Hey, here's Mr. Hand here. Wow.
And Bruce Willis as the voice of Mikey.
Help! Help! Put me back in! Put me back in!
So you're the one that's been kicking me.
The one that ate all that spicy food.
Now Mikey's mommy needs his help.
I'm gonna get you the best daddy there is.
All right, I'm on the case too.
But when you think like this little guy,
Boy, I gotta think about getting my own place.
there's a lot to distract you.
One of those little furry things over here.
That then is a clip from 1989's Look Who's Talking, written and directed by Amy Heckerling and starring John Travolta, Kirstie Alley, Olympia Dukakis, George Segal, with the voice of Bruce Willis topping off the cast list. So 1989 was a year in Hollywood when actor paydays just got turned on their head, and the big infamous story is that of Jack Nicholson being cast in Tim Burton's Batman film, and not just negotiating a sizable upfront fee to appear in the film, but also a percentage of profits not just off Batman but also its subsequent sequels. This was a deal that was said to have earned Nicholson for his role in the film over $50 million. However, there was another story that very same year of Bruce Willis managing to pick up an 8-figure payday just for doing a bit of voiceover work. And that's where the story of Look Who's Talking comes to. It was at that stage the most lucrative assignment of his career, and that's not bad for a film that Hollywood onlookers figured had just been dumped to off-season, that the parent studio behind it had no confidence in it. Not so, as we're about to find out. And so the idea for the film came to Amy Heckerling, writer-director, married to another writer-director, actually, Neil Israel, who'd made the film Bachelor Party. But Heckerling's big success at this point had been Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And, I mean, it was depressingly rare in the 1980s, and I'm not saying it's been a complete turnaround now, for a female director to have such a success and then to be able to secure other directing assignments afterwards. And she did. I mean, she directed the films Johnny Dangerously with Michael Keaton. She directed directed National Lampoon's European Vacation. That was 1985. She described the making of those two films as, quote, nightmares from hell. But at a point where male directors were failing and getting another movie, female directors, as a rule, if they had a flop movie, and look this up if you don't believe me, were very, very lucky to get another gig. I look at the career of someone as brilliant as Rachel Talalay, who's been doing some wonderful work in television, but in the aftermath of the mid-1990s film Tank Girl, which was taken out of her hands, she was left to carry the can for a final cut she didn't necessarily agree with, and it took her over 20 years to get another film made. So the fact that Amy Heckerling was still getting directing assignments was, I mean, depressingly, still an incredible achievement at this point. But it would take a few years after National Lampoon's European Vacation for her next film to come together, and she had a child in the midst of that period as well, and that would prove to be a pivotal catalyst for what was going to come next. Because she was in her mid-30s when she'd had her daughter, and as she talked to the Los Angeles Times, her daughter would just sit on the table in this baby seat and just endlessly look around. And Heckerling described how, quote, my husband and I just started to put words in her mouth, what she might be thinking based on her expressions. Like when the baby in the film looks at the woman's breast, I'm quoting, this isn't me going down this road, looks at the woman's breast and says lunch, kids are always grabbing at your clothes if you're a woman, Heckerling explained, describing that to children, it's a soda fountain. And so there was the nucleus of a film idea in this, and Heckerling started noodling really what to do with it. And she considered how to approach a film where a voice was given to the baby in a kind of, at one stage, a slightly darker family comedy. And so there was a moment, for instance, as she describes to the Los Angeles Times, introducing us to the baby, Mikey, in the film in unborn state and giving him a voice there and then. And she said, I didn't want to do a pro-life type of movie. I wanted to do something that was a fantasy. And so instead of giving the baby voice right from the start in the womb, she decided to make sperm talk. And it's not really a phrase I've said often in this podcast, but here we go. Sperm will be making a return soon. So she got her pitch together and she took it around town. And again, Heckerling had a successful movie to her name as well, but the rejections were coming, and they were coming fairly quickly. Warner Brothers turned it down, for instance. Orion Pictures, at that stage, a thriving independent, and you would have thought this might be a bit up their street. Nope, a no-go there. Disney, perhaps less surprisingly, turned it down, but Disney turned Look Who's Talking down because its executives feared the film was too sexual for them. Disney didn't really do sperm, just as a rule of thumb. But the president of TriStar Pictures, a man called Jeff Sagansky, he saw something in it. And this was a stage, again, it is worth reiterating because the Los Angeles Times article makes note of this. Heckerling wasn't coming off a big hit. She was not a hot upcoming director whose name would just open doors. Her last film had just done, well, not great. However, Sagansky saw something in the idea, saw something in Heckerling as well, and he cut a deal, giving Heckerling the funds and the time to sit down and write the movie she actually wanted to make. That her last couple of films have been scripted by other people. This was a chance for her to write and direct. And so casting came together relatively quickly. I mean, Kirstie Alley was chosen for the female lead role. And it was very early on too that John Travolta bobbled to the top of the pile for the Look Who's Talking cast. Now, this was John Travolta in the first of his career lulls, that his last big studio release at that point had been Staying Alive, which I think was 83 off the top of my head. He hadn't actually acted in a major Hollywood film for many years. But Heckerling was in conversation with his manager, a man called Jonathan D. Crane. Now, Crane was going to have a slightly wider impact on the film than just supplying his client. But it was Crane who asked Heckerling if there was anything for Travolta in the film that Heckerling was developing, and yeah, there was. And so whilst the lead male character at that stage was slightly darker, Heckerling began to consider, well, with Travolta in the lead, I could rewrite this. I got to write in a dancing scene, and Julie wrote in a dancing scene. But then, with the deal for Travolta coming aboard being done, well, Crane was also a film producer, and he didn't just help get Travolta on the film, but he came in with an offer to produce the film for half of the anticipated budget. And so Look Who's Talking originally was going to post it around the $13 million mark, around the same price as The Spy Who Loved Me that we were talking about just before. But what Crane realised and put to TriStar, put to heckling as well, is you could do this a lot cheaper, because whilst the film was ostensibly set in New York City, why not go and shoot it in Vancouver? Because then you could just redress a couple of areas of the Canadian city, make it look a bit New Yorky, and the price would come down to half. I mean, that level of saving on the film. Now, it's fairly commonplace now that Canadian locations double for American locations. Heck, I'm in the UK, and we've had Glasgow doubling for Gotham City with the Batman in more recent times as well. It was rarer at this stage, and it was something fairly radical that Crane was suggesting. However, I mean, gift horses and mouths, you could halve the budget. Yeah, why not? And so, in spite of the fact Travolta hadn't taken on a lead role in 4 years, he signed on the dotted line. The decision was made to relocate the shoot to Vancouver. The budget was, I mean, it ultimately bobbled up to $7.5 million, albeit with a very generous back-end deal, which I've alluded to already. This was pressing forward. Kirstie Alley was the female co-star, but Gina Davis at one stage came close to landing that role. However, she'd been tackling a birth sequence in a film called The Fly. You might remember it a few years previously, and it wasn't said to be high on her list to have and go at another one on screen either. And it would be Alley who signed on the dotted line opposite Travolta. Then there was the voice of Mikey, the baby. Now, it went to Bruce Willis. I think we've established that already. He wasn't the only person in the running for it. So Bruce Willis, at the point this was being cast, 1988, early 1989, he was diehard Bruce Willis. And, I mean, to many of us, he's still diehard Bruce Willis. But that was the one big hit he'd had to his name. He'd landed a salary of $5 million thanks to a terrific agent for Die Hard, but at that stage, when he took that salary, he was coming from the TV show Moonlighting, and it was very much an unknown. Can someone make the jump from TV to film? And in the aftermath of Die Hard, he'd done a small drama that hadn't done great guns at the box office. And so the list for who was going to provide the voice, well, there were quite a few names on it, but also there were quite a few comedies filming at this stage that were taking up the time of a lot of the rival talent. So, for instance, Ghostbusters 2 was shooting. Its schedules were going to clash. And so Bill Murray was out. Dan Aykroyd was out. They were both believed to be considered for Look Who's Talking at one point. The wonderful, wonderful, wonderful film Parenthood, well, that took Steve Martin out of the equation because Ron Howard was shooting that. What about John Candy? Well, there was Uncle Buck happening, so Candy wasn't an option. Robin Williams was said to have been in the mix as well. He'd broken through with Good Morning Vietnam at this stage, but it was his rep who was said to have priced him out of the film, ironically, given the amount that ultimately would be paid to the person who took this role. And according to a Premiere article in its April 1990 issue, it was Bruce Willis's agent who negotiated a deal that gave him a very slight upfront fee, but the back end would be 8 to 10% of the first dollar gross of the film. So that's even before all the deductions have come out. And so this, I mean, it was, again, pretty much a no-brainer to TriStar. There weren't massive expectations of this film. If it could turn a nice little profit, that's fine. But no one was expecting it to become quite what it became. And so the deal was signed. It meant the whole budget had come together for, under $8 million. Olympia Dukakis came in as well. She talked to the AV Club about this, and she said they hired me for that prior to the Academy Awards, and they said if I got the Academy Award, they'd pay me $50,000 to do that. And she got an Academy Award. She won that for Best Supporting Actress for a brilliant film, Moonstruck, and that's how she got a $50,000 payday. And she said it was the first job after she got the Oscar, that or Working Girl, but she liked the director so much, Amy Heckerling. She told the AV Club she was terrific. She didn't do the third one, but she did do the first two. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later as well. And so, on the 25th of May, 1988, filming began on the movie that was working with the title Daddy's Home. That was the original working title of the film. And so let's talk fetuses. It's been some time. Now, the opening of Look Who's Talking, if you've not seen it, we're in the womb. Again, we're being very candid. We're all grown-ups. We can have this conversation without being immature about it. And so we were in the pre-digital age here, really, as well. There was a little bit of digital trickery, but if you wanted to put something on screen, you generally had to do it practically. And so that meant for the pre-birth sequences that we see in Look Who's Talking, it meant some very unusual jobs for a bunch of puppets and a bunch of puppeteers. There were sperm then. Again, I'm obsessed. Sperm was made out of vinyl for the purposes of this. It was manufactured and duly operated by puppeteers whose job it was to manipulate sperm for a day or two of work. A little bit of digital effects work, and it was Todd Masters who was hired to oversee all of these sequences. And he described how there was one shot that took 115 takes to get. And that was little Mikey in the womb playing with his placenta. How do you realise a shot of an unborn baby playing with his placenta? I hear you. I know this is a podcast and generally a one-way conversation, but it's the obvious question. Well, I'm glad you asked. 12 puppeteers. There were people hanging upside down for a shot in the end that was ultimately cut from the film as well. There was clear chemistry coming together between the two leads as well, Kirstie Alley and John Travolta. And Alley was candid about this in an interview that she subsequently gave. Not in a mucky business kind of way, but as Amy Heckerling described to The Wrap, it wasn't like she went around being gaga over him. Heckerling just said their friendship and their chemistry was really interesting. And in fact, Alley would tell Barbara Walters in an interview, I think it was back 2012, that she regarded Travolta as the love of her life. And clearly the working relationship on the movie was a very, very strong one. The big challenge, though, for Heckerling was how do you wrangle a load of babies? Because, what is it, never worked with small children and pets? Here she was working with babies to make this work. And so, I mean, it's fairly obvious. They had to get several babies on set in order to keep the production motoring. And as such, there were also several baby wranglers on set to make sure that at least one of the infants would be ready for a take when it was required. And there was a lot of waiting around for a baby to be in the right mood in order for Heckerling to get the shots that she needed. Still, filming was wrapped up on this one in under 3 months. The last shots were called on the 20th of July 1988. But there was going to be quite a lot of post-production work on this, although not an awful lot of post-production work for Bruce Willis, because he came in and did 4 days worth of work on the film, laying down the tracks of the voice of Mikey. And Heckerling, for one, was like hugely grateful for his involvement and his contribution, that he was able to riff in the recording booth. And she knew when she was shooting the film, she had the confidence that as much as what she was getting in the camera sometimes might be a little bit dry, that she had the trump card, that the voice was going to be overlaid, going back to those moments with her daughter just sat on the table and adding dialogue to her head. She knew that she'd be able to punch up a lot of the scenes, and she knew that she wouldn't get a proper impression of how this was working until Willis's work was overlaid on. And true to form, it just worked. A rough cut of Look Who's Talking was prepared for February of 1989, so there was a good 5-6 months of solid post-production there. But it was at this point that TriStar was originally looking to release the film in March, so it was coming in quite close. But there was still time to do some of those test screenings. Now, the test screenings were kept under lock and key. This wasn't the era where the internet would spill how scores of such films were going. But TriStar was getting ecstatic responses to the film, that it was a clear, crowd-pleasing movie, and it might just have something a little bit more than it may have initially expected, certainly for such a modest budget. And so what it decided to do was take a little bit of a gamble, and it had to play a bit of a PR exercise here as well, because there was a concern in the midst of all of this that the competition in 1989 was looking a bit tough. This was the year of Batman, after all, that March was perhaps pushing it a little bit fine. Would you want to release this in the summer? Well, TriStar decided no. And instead what it decided to do was to move the release of Look Who's Talking to October 1989. October now, I mean, it's just a month in the calendar where a big blockbuster could land. October in 1989, well, that just said you're dumping that in the off-peak period of the year because you've not got confidence in the film. You're just giving it a release, trying to get a bit of money back and almost cutting your losses. That was the assumption, certainly coming through from the Hollywood trade press as well, that TriStar just had a dud on its hands, and so it was just almost washing its hands of it. And when the first reviews for the film came in as well, I mean, there wasn't an awful lot to dissuade people from that notion. That the release date was pegged for October the 13th, 1989. And the reviews were just, they were all right. The novelty of the concept really was the thing that got people interested, that there wasn't perhaps that many laughs in it. There was a little bit of pushback on that. I mean, comedies and critics don't tend to go too well together. And I mean, you call this a solid 3 stars based on the initial response that the film got. However, what happened next was the film went nuts at the box office, and it opened that weekend of October the 13th to the 15th opposite, and this was the big competition it was against, Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers. Also opening that same weekend was The Fabulous Baker Boys, and a Woody Allen film, Crimes and Misdemeanors, had a small opening as well. Breaking In turned up that week, and Look Who's Talking absolutely trounced them. $12.1 million opening weekend in October in Hollywood. And to put that into some degree of context, the weekend before, the box office was topped by Parenthood on its 10th week with, $2-3 million coming in. Now, in had come Look Who's Talking with a huge opening, certainly for a comedy and very much for October as well. To the delight of TriStar executives as well. I mean, it's worth noting Halloween 5 grossed $5 million. It more than doubled the film in second place. Look Who's Talking was holding its audience. The following week, Next of Kin came out. That's Patrick Swayze, off the top of my head, a Warner Brothers movie. That opened with $4.8 million. And get this, Look Who's Talking's box office went up. Its weekend gross for weekend 2 was $14.1 million, based off the word of mouth. It was up 16.8% in the US on its second weekend in cinemas. Its third weekend, it did $11.5 million, while films like Shocker and The Bear came in and couldn't scrape together half of Look Who's Talking's money. And it was there for weeks. It topped the box office chart by week 5. It was still grossing $11 million a weekend. And the film that ultimately dethroned it was Eddie Murphy's directorial debut, Harlem Nights, which came in a month after its release. Look Who's Talking had a 5-week stint at the top, and Harlem Nights grossed $16 million, weekend of November the 17th and 19th. Look Who's Talking still $8.5 million, and by the time Look Who's Talking left US cinemas alone, it had $140 million in the bank. Now, this again was an era where international releases were staggered. We didn't get Look Who's Talking in the UK until Easter the following year. But also there was a very savvy trick that TriStar deployed in terms of getting the film out and about around the world, because the consensus generally was that American comedies didn't tend to travel that well at this stage. In fact, it's only in recent times that the blockbuster comedy has gone around the world. However, an idea was put to heckling by John Travolta of getting the role of baby Mikey recorded by prominent talent in different regions around the world and playing to localised star systems. I mean, you've got John Travolta and Kirstie Alley. You didn't necessarily need Bruce Willis. Get someone who was popular in that area to re-record the role. And that worked an absolute treat as well. Look Who's Talking's non-US gross was more than its US gross in the end, and by the time it had finished its run in cinemas alone, $297 million worldwide had been banked for this film, $7.5 million budget, and if you're doing your sums, Bruce Willis got $8-10 million of the first dollar gross of those takings. A very, very savvy piece of agent negotiation there. Now, there were, as with many successes, a lawsuit in the aftermath. In this case, the New York Times reported that writers and producers Jeannie Myers and Rita Stern alleged copyright infringement against Heckling and TriStar, and alleging that she stole the basic premise and large chunk, this is quoted words, and large chunks of her 1989 hit Look Who's Talking from a student project given to her 3 years before the film's release. Now, the New York Times reported that this was quietly settled. It was settled and details never disclosed. But it's one of those things that I've noticed doing lots of episodes of this, that when there's a hit out of nowhere, there's usually a court case that tends to follow it. There's usually a sequel as well, and Look Who's Talking was no different. However, what was different was the speed that the sequel came about in. So a couple of episodes ago, I talked about Bad Moms and how a sequel to that came about in just over a year, of Bad Moms Christmas, which ultimately seemed to sink chances of a third film. Look Who's Talking 2 would follow Look Who's Talking by about 13 months. And as I understand it, at the point Look Who's Talking landed in cinemas, not a page of Look Who's Talking 2 had been written. In fact, Heckling was giving interviews at one stage about considering other projects she wanted to make, but TriStar could smell money, wanted a follow-up. The novelty could extend as well, that the character of Mikey has a baby sister, so why not play with that a little bit. And so Look Who's Talking To came together, was released in 1990, that Heckling wrote with Neil Israel, and Roseanne Barr came in as Mikey's sister. There was some casting that didn't happen. So Joan Rivers had been teased in the original film to take on voicing duties in the sequel, but her scheduling counted her out of this, and Richard Pryor was mentioned too, but he also dropped out. However, this was heavily criticised when it landed in December 1990 as let's just say, a not very adventurous sequel, to the point where even the entire opening seemed to be a repeat of the original film. Lightning didn't strike twice. Well, in fact, he didn't strike 3 times, because, not dissuaded, TriStar thought, well, if we're not getting anywhere with babies, let's bring some animals in. And as such, Tom Ropolowski took over for Look Who's Talking Now, which arrived on November the 5th, 1993. John Travolta, Kirstie Alley, and then Diane Keaton and Danny DeVito as voices of dogs. And guess what? That hardly brought home the bacon either. In fact, that one on paper seemed to make a loss, and plans for a Look Who's Talking 4, well, they were quickly gone. There has, I should note, been talk of a modern day reboot of the film. Jeremy Garlick, who's currently, at the point this is being recorded, about to release Murder Mystery 2 with Adam Sandler and Jennifer Aniston, also directed The Wedding Ringer. He was said to be working on a screenplay a year or two ago. No further word on that, however, and as such, Look Who's Talking currently stands as a trilogy. But if they do get a 4th one going, and they are looking for a new voice for the character of Mikey, I'm just going to get my agent onto this, and I'm quite willing to undercut the 8-figure salary that Willis got paid for the first one. Fair play to him for getting him. I can do it a bit cheaper. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. Twitter's still alive at the point this has been recorded. Film Stories is on Twitter at Film Stories. If you want us on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We're on YouTube, youtube.com/Film Stories. We're on TikTok somewhere, but I can never quite remember where, although we're getting some bizarrely high numbers on there as well. Thank you to everyone who's following us and watching and seeing what mischief we're up to. If you go to our website, filmstories.co.uk, that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, mischief. And at store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find our sizable collection of print magazines that we're making here from the heart of the UK. Slightly different film magazine, very proud of it, and any support you can give it is much appreciated. But I think that's it for now. The main thing, as always, is you all stay safe and well. You look after yourselves. You enjoy your movies. And I thank you so much for listening. I thank you so much for your time. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.